Hi, good afternoon. Great pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the big issues that I think we need to grapple at any level of city making, whether it's a mayor, whether it's a designer, whether it's a policymaker or a consumer. And this comes out of work we've been doing at the London School of Economics now for about 10 years in a research project called The Urban Age, which you see there, which looks at a number of cities. We hold conferences there, we do research, and most recently in Delhi. Now, the one thing I want to start by saying is that, and this is very obvious to many of you in the room, is that cities are not the same around the world. If you just look at this map, which shows in yellow where the UN says growth is going to be over the next 20 years or so, 15 years or so, you can see that it's unequally distributed. Growth is going to be mainly in Africa, mainly in parts of Asia, India in particular, while in green it shows where cities have grown over the last decade or so. Why is this important to these discussions? Because every type of city and every different part of urban growth, and particularly in Africa, particularly in parts of the poorer Asia, there are conditions which are to do with exclusion and to do with the environment, which is really all I want to talk about. You can hardly see this from where you are in the room. It doesn't really matter. But, we tend to think that the fastest growing cities are in Shanghai, say, Latin America. No, actually, they're now in Lagos, Nairobi, it's parts of the world, including parts of Afghanistan, where it's happening. So bear in mind that these are places which have other problems that need to be dealt with, and therefore governance, the politics of cities is absolutely fundamental, as you well know. Now, as someone who's trained in a background of design, there are many of you here too, the shape of the city, and this is probably the most important thing I want to say, the shape of the city, the form of the city, actually has incredible impacts on the environment and on social inclusion. This is something that sometimes is left behind in the discussions of where cities are going. So we have choices. We all have choices. You can either go this way, the endless city, a city which goes on and on and on, that for 22 million people it never stops. I just came back yesterday from Tokyo, as it happens, not Hong Kong, which is amazing. 36 million people actually quite close together, living in some degree of harmony. This is another choice. You control land. The landscape itself, of course, helps shape this, but also there's a political system that makes this one of the most efficient systems in the world. Or you can do this. Barcelona, I'll come back to this at the end, which is in many ways one of the most interesting ways of dealing with density, the public realm and everything. These are not just beautiful photographs. These are beautiful cities, which actually work very well. Most of the urbanization that we're interested in here, in the CityLab conference, and all of us working in cities, is actually like this. And on your right, you have what sort of architects and planners do. Then you have what transport planners do in the middle. And then it's the rest of the slide. That's actually what happens. How do you deal with that is a question that we need to understand. How do you deal with that without investing and creating even greater sort of social exclusion? This picture is now well known to most of you, I think. It's a favela on one side without water and basic services, with one of the biggest towers, very recent towers, about 10 years ago now, where the buildings are, or the owners are so wealthy that they have a swimming pool on each terrace. Now, I have nothing against investment, growth, and the market. I have a lot against when you build difference in stone, which is what you see here. There are two aspects which, of course, concern all of us in cities. It's the environmental one. We wouldn't be in this room. Michael Bloomberg wouldn't be running C40 or set it up if it weren't for the fact that we know now that cities consume something like 75% contribute to 75% of CO2 emissions. So a small change, 10%, makes a big difference to the planet. But the other side of the coin is just as important. One of every three of you will be living in the yellow bits of that map that I showed you in areas without basic services, without access to water, infrastructure, or the basic elements of well-being. So how do these two things come together? Some of the work we've done at the LSE literally maps about 400 cities around the world on this diagram. On the horizontal axis, sort of coming towards me on this side, is the Human Development Index. The more you're on the right-hand side, the longer life expectancy, higher education levels, and lower unemployment. On the vertical axis in green is basically how much energy we use. Now, what you see up on the top right, now we don't want to be unkind, particularly to our American hosts, but unfortunately, the United States of America, of course, great Human Development Index, but if you consider that that's the level of energy we need in one Earth. To live like the USA or other places, Australia and others, we need 5 Earths. And we know that's not sustainable. So the question is, how do we begin to design, and this is where the model of Copenhagen, the model of London to a degree, I have to say, certainly the model of Barcelona begins to bring these two worlds together. So it's a question for CityLab, for the mayors represented here, which way do we actually go, and it's a choice. Here's some work that we've done at the LSE which tries to bring these issues together. It's a comparison of where people live and where people work in 3 different cities, London, New York, and Hong Kong. On the lower side, on the left-hand side as you're looking, is where the residential density is. Basically, if there were 3 times the number of people in this room, that density would be higher and you'd see the spikes being further up, okay? It's residential density. The other diagram is where people work. So you can see that there's quite a distance between the two. The number of people actually working in London is in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, every day, with a pretty good public transport system, expensive, as you know, but it works. This is New York. Same number of people, 8.6 million, twice the residential density, but even more people actually coming together. And this is Hong Kong. This is very, very interesting because actually the residential density and the work density is not this similar. This is why you have 93% of the population of Hong Kong take public transport, and something like commuting times is something like 20 minutes for a city of 7 million people. These are the issues before us as investors, as decision makers of what cities can be. Now, nothing makes it more obvious than a comparison, and I'm sorry to say, Atlanta, a US city, and Barcelona, with exactly the same population. Look at the footprint and the difference between the two. There's so many cities that are represented here and elsewhere which actually have been able to bring us on that bottom right-hand part of the map towards a sustainable model. Jan Geld is here, and he knows all about Copenhagen. In other words, these cities have been able to increase their income, their demographic growth, their well-being, but reduce the actual amount of energy used per person. And that's exactly, it's this split that we're talking about, which must be the model, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Northern Europe, or anywhere else in the world. Each city will have its own different solution. This is one way of going, which is São Paulo, 8,000% growth since the beginning of the last century. Out of interest in London, we've grown 16% in a century. So different cities have different periods of growth and change. And this is the model. Also driven by the simple fact that this is where the car industry of Brazil is. You know, there's a reason. These things are connected. 4-hour commutes is probably not a sustainable way of going forward. The biggest impact here, and this is where I want to connect the environmental issue again with the exclusion, social exclusion one, is that those who have less access to work, to infrastructure, to schools are pushed out way at the edges of the city. Some of them are close by, as we saw in that slide with the swimming pool, but this is the problem that needs to be tackled and is a transport problem, is a governance problem, and is a social exclusion problem. Now, many of you are from London. You heard Boris earlier today, and this is a view of, let's call it, or I want to talk a little bit about in the few minutes remaining, of the same problem, so to speak, in a big city like London. London has extended over the centuries. It's a quite dispersed city, as we saw before, and its greatest area of opportunity in many ways is in the east, which is where you see here, Docklands, Canary Wharf, and beyond. But this is the map that I'd like you, for those of you who are not Londoners, to remember. In red, you can see the River Thames in the middle. In red, you see the most deprived. People with the lowest life expectancy, people with highest unemployment, and all the other sort of attributes which make up social deprivation. In green, you see the opposite. Broadly speaking, only broadly speaking, you have a phenomenon which is very different here from, say, Paris. You have East London, which is more deprived. Most of West London, with 1 or 2 exceptions, is more affluent. And the whole edge of the city is actually really well off. I bet you that Bristol would be different, George, and any other city would be different. How do you deal with this? How does Boris Johnson, how did Ken Livingstone actually deal with this? Just think of this. If you take the underground station in Parliament Square and you go east to where the Olympics are, you lose 1 year of life expectancy in this city as a man. That's the same difference between Quito and Buenos Aires, and between Ho Chi Minh City and Hong Kong. So continental differences between our own city. That's to do with diet, it's to do with education and many other things. We at the LSE, of course, take this very seriously, so we have to do a diagram which tells you what it's really about. But this is, say, every city has its differences, right? How do you deal with it? Is this a planning issue? Is this a governance issue? And I think three-dimensional organization and the shape of the city is important. Because, in London, you could say we have two Londons still today. New York, that's the basic story behind the current administration. We have two Londons physically. We have the Kensingtons and we have the, let's call it negative side, but I don't call it negative. It's the opportunity areas of the Royal Docks and what's happening there. And that's why Boris, I don't know if he talked about it today, but most importantly, the London Plan, the document which says what we should be doing, is trying to resolve the issue of infrastructure, to try and resolve the issue of inequality by investing in East London. Of course, the big Crossrail project is all about that. Let me conclude by bringing it down to roots. A city like Mumbai, which will grow by 2,000% and have the largest population in the world by 2030 or 2050, has had to deal with intractable problems. But if you go down to the fine grain, it's really quite interesting what you see. You need to deal with housing, you need to deal with infrastructure, you need to deal with population. But what is interesting here is that on the left-hand side, in one of the typical slums of Mumbai, you find actually that communities work together to create a community toilet. Now, you might say, well, so what? Well, actually, community toilets in terms of the well-being of men and women, and particularly of women and children, is fundamental. But on the ground floor, you have a communal kitchen, and on the upper level, you have a place where a few computers are brought in from local businesses. The quality of the food and the quality of the learning is very much part of this infrastructure at the micro scale. So the lesson really, in terms of the research we've done, is to try and intervene in the physical fabric of cities to make them more equitable and more environmentally sustainable. This is, of course, the work that the Bloomberg Foundation, we've been lucky at LSE Cities to work with them over the months and years, has been doing in terms of recognizing and awarding, in fact, significant prizes to different cities around the States and around Europe. And issues of what to do with aging people in Barcelona, what to do with unemployment, what to do when the system literally breaks down, as in many Greek cities, is at the heart of what they've done. And I think there's no other better model, and this is where I want to conclude, than Barcelona, that brings together the issue of urban form, visionary governance in terms of what to do, but to deal with this triad, and I think win-win situation of getting the form right, dealing with social sustainability and environmental sustainability. Thank you very much.